Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. The Emperor's most gifted son. In the vast and ancient darkness between the stars, the Emperor of Mankind set in motion one of the most ambitious and consequential acts of creation in the history of the human race. He crafted 20 souls, 20 Primarchs, each one a being of supreme physical and mental perfection, designed to lead his armies across the galaxy and reunite a scattered and suffering humanity beneath a single, unifying light. Each Primarch was a masterpiece in its own right, a fusion of science and will and something older and harder to name. But even among those 20 extraordinary beings, one stood apart. One carried within him a quality that the others could not match, a depth of intellect and psychic sensitivity that made him, by almost any measure, the most gifted of them all. That being was Magnus, the Primarch who would become the Red, the Crimson King, the sorcerer of Prospero. A figure whose story is one of the most beautiful and most devastating in all the long and sorrowful history of the 41st millennium. To understand what Magnus became, and what he lost, we must first understand what he was at the beginning. We must return to the moment of his making, and follow the long strange road that carried him from the Emperor's great laboratory beneath the mountains of terror, to the world that would shape everything he was ever going to be. Of the 20 Primarchs, almost all awoke to their new worlds without any memory of what they had been before. They were infants in the most complete sense, cast adrift with no knowledge of their origin, no awareness of the Father who had made them, no understanding of the vast design they had been born to serve. This absence of memory was, in many ways, a mercy. It allowed them to be shaped wholly by the worlds they landed on, to grow into themselves without the weight of what they had left behind. Magnus was different. From the earliest days of his life on the world that claimed him, he carried within himself something that none of his brothers possessed. He carried the memory of before. Not in precise and detailed images perhaps, but in a deep and resonant awareness, a sense of having existed in another place, of having been something other than what he now appeared to be. He knew, in some fundamental part of himself, that he had been made rather than born. He knew that there was a purpose to his existence that stretched far beyond the life he was currently living. This self-awareness set him apart from his very first moments. It gave him a quality of introspection and philosophical curiosity that would define every aspect of his character. Where other Primarchs threw themselves into the immediate world around them, Magnus looked inward and outward simultaneously, always searching for the deeper pattern beneath the surface of things. When the forces of chaos scattered the 20 Primarchs across the galaxy in that great and terrible act of sabotage, each one fell to a world that would, in its own way, reflect and amplify what they were. Magnus fell to Prospero. It was not a world of war, not a world of industrial might or savage wilderness. Prospero was something rarer and more unusual in the grim darkness of the far future. It was a world of the mind. A planet of scholars and seekers, of mystics and philosophers, of men and women who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms, including the most dangerous and forbidden kind. Prospero was home to a significant population of psychers, individuals gifted with sensitivity to the warp, to the vast and churning sea of psychic energy that lay beneath the surface of reality. On most worlds of the Immaterium, such people were feared, controlled, or destroyed. On Prospero, they were celebrated and studied. The society that Magnus arrived in was one that had already made peace, of a kind, with the uncanny and the strange. It was, in that sense, the perfect world for him. A world that would not flinch from what he was, that would instead reach out to meet him with open hands and open books, and invite him to become something greater than even he had imagined possible. No figure in Magnus's early life cast a longer shadow than the man known as Eamon. A seer and a scholar of considerable reputation on Prospero, Eamon was among the first to recognize what the strange and extraordinary child found on their world truly was. Where others might have been frightened, or reverent to the point of paralysis, Eamon approached Magnus with something far more valuable. He approached him with curiosity, with rigor, and with genuine affection. He became the young Primarch's teacher, his guide, and in many ways his closest companion during those formative years, when Magnus was still learning what kind of being he was, and what kind of life he wanted to live. Eamon taught him that knowledge was not merely a tool or a weapon, but a responsibility. That to seek understanding was a noble calling, but that understanding without wisdom was a blade without a hilt, likely to cut the hand that held it. These were lessons that Magnus absorbed deeply, and yet, as we shall see, not always completely enough. The relationship between mentor and student, between the old seer and the towering impossibly powerful young Primarch, was one of the most tender and intellectually rich in all the history of the Great Crusade era. Eamon gave Magnus something that even the Emperor, for all his vast power and vision, perhaps never quite managed to give him. He gave him a model of how to be wise, as well as brilliant. The world of Prospero shaped Magnus as much as any individual within it. His upbringing on that world of scholars and seekers gave him an education unlike anything any of his brothers received. Where a Primarch like Angron was forged in the brutality of the gladiatorial pit, and where Guilliman was shaped by the political and military traditions of Macragge, Magnus was raised in libraries and observatories, in halls of debate and chambers of psychic practice. His education was a vast and sprawling thing, encompassing history and philosophy, the sciences of the material world and the far stranger sciences of the immaterial one. He studied the nature of the warp not as a soldier studies a battlefield, calculating threat and advantage, but as a naturalist studies a new continent, with wonder, with patience, and with a deep desire to understand rather than simply to conquer. Psychic discipline was central to this education, and Magnus took to it with an aptitude that astonished even the most gifted teachers on Prospero. His power was immense, far beyond what anyone around him could fully comprehend, and yet he approached it with a scholar's care, learning to shape and direct it rather than simply unleashing it. This combination of raw power and intellectual discipline would make him, in time, one of the greatest psychers in the history of the Imperium. Perhaps the greatest of all, save only for the Emperor himself. In the early years of his life on Prospero, Magnus performed an act that established his role among the people of his adopted world in the most definitive way imaginable. Prospero, for all its culture and learning, was not a safe place in the psychic sense. The concentration of psychers on the planet, and the long tradition of warp study that defined its civilization, had attracted presences from the immaterial realm. Warp entities, things without names that fed on psychic energy and human fear, had established themselves in the world in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Magnus hunted them. With a combination of his extraordinary psychic power and the disciplined knowledge he had accumulated through years of study, he systematically identified and destroyed or banished these entities, cleansing Prospero of their influence in a campaign that took years and demanded everything he had. It was not a glamorous war. There were no great battles in the conventional sense, no armies meeting on open fields. It was a war of the mind and the soul, fought in hidden places and liminal spaces, in the gaps between the waking world and whatever lay beyond it. But when it was done, Prospero was safer than it had been in generations. And Magnus had proved something important, not just to the people of Prospero, but to himself. That his gifts were not merely a source of wonder. They were a source of protection. He was not just a scholar. He was a guardian. With Prospero cleansed and its people safe, Magnus took his place as the undisputed ruler of the world that had raised him. It was a role he accepted not through conquest or political maneuver, but through the simple and overwhelming reality of what he was and what he had done. The people of Prospero gave him their loyalty freely, because they understood, better than most, what it meant to have a being of his nature standing between them and the darkness. Under his rule, the capital city of Tizca was transformed. It had always been a place of learning, but Magnus elevated it into something extraordinary, something that became one of the wonders of the age. He built the great towers and academies, the libraries and psychic training facilities, the observatories and halls of debate that would make Tizca famous across the galaxy. The city became a monument to everything Magnus believed in. That knowledge was the highest aspiration of intelligent life. That understanding the universe, in all its complexity and danger, was the most worthwhile thing a thinking being could do. The Thousand Sons, the legion that would eventually come to serve him, were shaped by this philosophy from their very foundation. They were warriors, yes, as all Astartes were warriors, but they were scholars first. Men who fought so that others might have the peace to think, and who thought so that their fighting might carry some deeper meaning than mere violence ever could. The Crimson King. There are beings in the history of the Imperium who are known by a single name, and there are those whose nature is so vast and so multifaceted that no single name could ever contain them. Magnus belonged to the second kind. Over the course of his long and extraordinary life, he accumulated titles the way a great river accumulates tributaries, each one adding something to the whole, each one capturing a different angle of a personality and a power that resisted any simple definition. He was called the Crimson King, a title that carried within it something of majesty and something of menace, the suggestion of a ruler whose dominion was not merely political but elemental, whose authority was written into the fabric of reality itself. He was called the Red Cyclops, a name with older and stranger echoes, reaching back into the mythologies of old Earth and the stories humanity told itself in the long darkness before the age of technology. And he was called the Sorcerer King, perhaps the most direct of all his titles, the one that most plainly named what he was and what he did, and why so many, even among those who admired him, could never quite bring themselves to fully trust him. Each of these names was true. Each of them was incomplete. Together they begin to sketch the outline of a figure who was, in every sense of the word, singular. A being unlike any other in the long and crowded history of the Space Marine legions and the Primarchs who led them. The name Magnus the Red did not arise from abstraction or poetry alone. It had its roots in something immediate and physical, in the striking and unmistakable appearance of the Primarch himself. Magnus bore skin of a deep and vivid red, or in some accounts a rich copper tone, a coloration so unusual and so striking that it could not fail to define how those who met him perceived him. In a galaxy of grey armor and pale flesh and the endless brown and black of scorched worlds, Magnus blazed with color. He was impossible to overlook, impossible to forget. Some accounts place the origin of his name in his hair rather than his skin, describing a mane of fierce copper or deep red that framed his extraordinary face with something approaching flame. The truth, as is so often the case with figures of this magnitude, is probably that both things were true, and that the name arose not from any single feature but from the cumulative impression of a being who seemed, in his very coloring, to be set apart from the rest of his kind. Red has always carried meaning in human culture. It is the color of fire and of blood, of passion and of danger, of things that burn and things that hurt. That Magnus should carry it in his very skin feels, in retrospect, like a warning that nobody quite knew how to read. He was beautiful and he was alarming, and the red of him was both of those things at once. Of all the physical details that defined Magnus in the minds of those who knew him or knew of him, none was more immediately striking than the fact that he possessed only a single eye. Where his brothers had two, Magnus had one, and the story of how he came to lose the other is among the most revealing and most painful in all the lore surrounding him. The truth of it lies in one of his earliest acts of desperate love for the warriors who served him. The Thousand Sons, his legion, were afflicted in their earliest years by a catastrophic mutation, a flaw in their gene seed that caused their bodies to break down and transform in terrible and uncontrollable ways. Marines would simply cease to be themselves, their flesh running and changing until nothing recognizable remained. It was called the Flesh Change, and it threatened to destroy the Legion entirely. Magnus, refusing to accept that outcome, sought a solution with the same fierce and boundless determination he brought to every problem. He found one, but the price it demanded was enormous. He gave up his eye. Not in battle, not through accident, but deliberately, as the currency of a bargain struck in the deep and treacherous places where power is traded for power and nothing is ever given freely. He paid that price without hesitation, because the alternative was to watch his sons die, and that he would not do. The eye that Magnus lost was gone, but the eye that remained became something far more than an ordinary organ of sight. Those who stood before Magnus and met his gaze described an experience that went well beyond the merely physical. His remaining eye blazed. That was the word that appeared again and again in the accounts of those who encountered him, blazed, as though something behind it was perpetually alight, as though the psychic energy that suffused every part of his being had found, in that single eye, its most concentrated and visible expression. To look into it was to feel seen, in a way that most people had never felt seen before, and never would again. It was not a comfortable sensation. Magnus had the ability, whether intentional or not, to make those in his presence feel that he was perceiving not just their faces but their thoughts, their fears, their most private and carefully guarded inner lives. His eye cut through pretension and performance the way a torch cuts through fog, not cruelly, not with any desire to expose or humiliate, but simply because that was its nature. It could not help but illuminate. Among his own legion, that gaze was a source of deep pride, a reminder of what their Primarch was, and what he could see that others could not. Among those who distrusted him, it was one more reason for unease, one more piece of evidence that Magnus was not quite like anyone else, and that his differences were not trivial ones. To speak of Magnus as physically large is to engage in a kind of understatement so severe, it borders on absurdity. He was a Primarch, and Primarchs were already beings of extraordinary stature, towering over ordinary space marines, the way space marines towered over ordinary men. But even among his brothers, Magnus was remarkable for his sheer physical presence. He was a giant in the most literal sense, a being whose body matched the scale of his ambitions and his intellect, who occupied space in a way that made the space around him feel smaller and more defined simply by his being in it. Yet to reduce Magnus to his physical dimensions would be to miss the point of him almost entirely. The vastness that most defined him was not the vastness of his body but the vastness of his mind. He was an intellect of almost incomprehensible range and depth, a thinker who moved with equal ease across the material sciences and the psychic arts, across history and philosophy and the deep mysteries of the warp. His brothers were formidable in many ways, and several of them were men of considerable intelligence. But Magnus operated at a different level. He did not merely think. He perceived. He did not merely study. He understood. And in that understanding, that capacity to hold enormous complexity within himself and find the patterns that connected it all, he was, in the truest sense, a giant among giants, the most intellectually gifted son of the most powerful human being who had ever lived. The master of knowledge and sorcery. Long before the Emperor's great fleets reached Prospero, long before father and son stood together in the flesh for the first time and looked upon one another across the threshold of reunion, Magnus had already found a way to reach him. Where other Primarchs waited in silence for the day the crusade would arrive at their doorstep, Magnus, with the restless and probing intelligence that defined everything he did, reached outward. He touched the immaterial realm with his mind, extended his consciousness across the impossible distances of space, and found, somewhere in the vast and churning deep, the psychic signature of the one who had made him. He knew it immediately, the way a child knows a parent's voice even in a crowd, even across years of separation. The Emperor was there, present in the warp in a way that no ordinary being could be, and Magnus found him. What passed between them in those early communications is not fully recorded, and perhaps could not be, given the nature of what it was. A conversation held not in words but in something older and more direct, in the pure transmission of thought and feeling and meaning that only two minds of that caliber could sustain across such distances. But the significance of it cannot be overstated. Magnus did not wait to be found. He reached out and made contact, and in doing so, demonstrated something that would define his entire relationship with the Emperor. A desire for connection, for understanding, for closeness, that was as deep and as genuine as anything in his extraordinary nature. There is a question that hangs over any honest account of Magnus the Red, and it is simply this: how powerful was he? The answer, when you follow the evidence of his life and the testimony of those who witnessed what he could do, is both simple and staggering. Among all the beings of psychic sensitivity in the history of the Immaterium, in an organization that numbered countless gifted individuals across 10,000 years of recorded history, Magnus stood at a level that only one other being had ever reached. He was surpassed, in the estimation of those who studied such things, only by the Emperor himself. That is not a modest claim. The Emperor was the most powerful human psychic who had ever existed, a being whose abilities bent the fabric of reality and whose mind had shaped the history of an entire species across millennia. To be second only to that, was to occupy a position so elevated that any further comparison became meaningless. Magnus was not merely a gifted psyker among many. He was the greatest sorcerer in human history, a title that was not hyperbole but simple description. He could do things that other psykers could not conceive of, could reach places in the immaterial realm that would have destroyed lesser minds on contact, could shape and direct psychic energy with a precision and a power that left those who witnessed it struggling to find adequate language for what they had seen. His gifts were not just a part of him. They were, in a very real sense, the most essential thing about him. One of the most extraordinary expressions of Magnus's psychic power was his ability to separate his consciousness from his body and send it outward into the world, or indeed into the warp, as a presence independent of his physical form. He could project himself across distances that would have been impossible for any conventional means of communication, appearing before distant individuals not as a disembodied voice or a vague impression, but as a fully realized psychic avatar, a version of himself rendered in light and will and focused intention, that could speak, gesture, and interact with the world around it, in ways that made the distinction between presence and absence feel almost irrelevant. This ability was not merely a convenience, though it was certainly that. It was a window into the way Magnus experienced reality, which was fundamentally different from the way most beings experienced it. For him, the boundaries between here and there, between self and world, between the material and the immaterial, were always somewhat permeable. His mind did not recognize the same walls that contained ordinary consciousness. It pressed against them constantly, and in pressing, found that they gave way. The ability to project psychic avatars was perhaps the most vivid demonstration of what his power actually felt like from the inside, the sense of a mind so vast and so capable that the body housing it was, in some ways, almost incidental. Almost a convenience. A place to rest between the larger adventures of pure thought. Magnus did not come to his understanding of the warp through accident or inheritance alone. He pursued it with the fierce and systematic dedication of a scholar who has found the subject that will define his life and is determined to leave no stone unturned in its study. He sought out ancient lore wherever it could be found, texts and artifacts and traditions that predated the Immaterium and in some cases predated recorded human history entirely. He was drawn to forbidden knowledge not because he was reckless or because he sought power for its own sake, but because he was constitutionally unable to accept that any door should remain permanently closed to understanding. The idea that there were things which ought not to be known was, to Magnus, a kind of philosophical heresy, an abdication of the responsibility that came with having a mind capable of asking questions. If something existed, it could in principle be understood. If it could be understood, it should be understood. This was not naivety. Magnus was too intelligent for naivety. He understood the dangers that lay in the deep places of the warp, understood that the knowledge he sought was dangerous precisely because it was powerful. But he believed, with a conviction that no argument could fully shake, that the danger lay not in the knowledge itself but in the ignorance of those who encountered it unprepared. The solution to dangerous knowledge was not prohibition. It was better knowledge still, and the wisdom to handle it carefully. Among all of Magnus's beliefs, perhaps none was more sweeping or more consequential in its implications than his conviction about the future of humanity itself. He did not see the human race as it was in the 41st millennium as its final form. He saw it as a species in the middle of a transformation, moving slowly and painfully and often without understanding, toward something new and something greater. Specifically, he believed that humanity was destined to become a psychic species, that the emergence of psychers across the population was not an anomaly or a corruption but the first stirrings of an evolutionary shift that would eventually encompass all of mankind. In this vision, the struggles and dangers of the present, the horror of demonic possession, the risks of warp exposure, the fear and persecution that psychers so often faced, were not signs that psychic development was wrong or unnatural. They were the pains of transition, the difficulties that attended any profound change in a species still learning to understand what it was becoming. Magnus held this belief not abstractly, but with the passion of a man who could see in himself what humanity might one day be. He was, in his own understanding, not an exception to the human condition but a preview of it. A glimpse of what was possible, if humanity could only find the courage and the wisdom to embrace its own potential rather than fear it. The corollary to Magnus's belief in humanity's psychic destiny was his conviction about the warp itself. Where the orthodoxy of the Immaterium, and particularly the orthodoxy that would eventually harden into the doctrines of the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition, tended to view the warp as something fundamentally hostile and alien, something to be feared and contained and interacted with only under the most controlled and desperate circumstances, Magnus held a fundamentally different view. He believed that the warp was not, in its essence, an enemy. It was a mystery. A vast and complex and genuinely dangerous mystery certainly, one that demanded the utmost care and discipline from anyone who approached it. But a mystery of the same fundamental kind as any other mystery that faced an inquiring mind. Something that could, in principle, be understood. And something that, once understood, could be worked with rather than merely endured. He believed that through wisdom and discipline and the accumulation of genuine knowledge about the warp's nature and its rules, humanity could learn to navigate it without being destroyed by it. That the relationship between the material and the immaterial did not have to be one of perpetual warfare and loss, but could become something more like the relationship between a skilled sailor and a dangerous sea. Still risky, still demanding, but ultimately navigable by those with the knowledge and the courage to try. The philosophy that Magnus held in his own mind and heart was not kept separate from the legion he led. It permeated every aspect of Thousand Sons culture, from the way recruits were selected and trained, to the way campaigns were planned and executed. From the organization of the legion's internal hierarchy, to the physical spaces in which its warriors lived and worked. The Thousand Sons were not, first and foremost, warriors. They were scholars who happened also to be warriors, men who had been selected as much for their psychic sensitivity and their intellectual curiosity as for their physical capability. Their fortress monastery on Prospero was as much a university as a barracks, a place where the study of sorcery and the study of history and the study of the warp were given as much time and attention as the study of tactics and the practice of arms. This was not always appreciated by the rest of the Immaterium, and certainly not by all of Magnus's brother Primarchs, several of whom viewed the Thousand Sons with a mixture of suspicion and distaste that bordered on contempt. But within the legion itself, The culture that Magnus had built was a source of profound pride and deep loyalty. His sons believed in what they were doing. They believed that knowledge was worth pursuing at any cost, that understanding was a form of service, and that in their libraries and their laboratories and their psychic studies, they were doing something that mattered. Something that would, one day, make a difference to the fate of the species they had sworn to protect. The Curse of the Thousand Suns. When the Emperor reunited with Magnus on Prospero and looked upon what his son had built there, he did not hesitate. Magnus was given command of the 15th Legion, the warriors who would become known across the galaxy as the Thousand Suns, and in that moment of formal investiture something clicked into place with the inevitability of two things that had always been meant to find each other. The Legion and the Primarch were a match in the most complete sense. They were warriors drawn from worlds with traditions of psychic practice and scholarly pursuit, men who had been shaped by their origins into something different from the standard template of Astartes culture. They were curious where others were simply obedient. They were reflective where others were instinctive. They asked questions that made their brothers uncomfortable and pursued answers in places that made the rest of the Immaterium deeply uneasy. Under any other Primarch, these qualities might have been disciplined out of them, or simply left to wither for want of encouragement. Under Magnus, they flourished. He looked at his legion and saw in them a reflection of his own deepest convictions, that the life of the mind was not a distraction from the warrior's path but its highest expression, that a space marine who understood why he fought was worth more than 10 who simply knew how. He poured himself into them completely, and they received him with a devotion that went beyond the loyalty most legions felt for their primarchs, into something closer to reverence. But there was a shadow at the heart of the Thousand Suns from the very beginning, a darkness woven into the genetic inheritance that Magnus passed to his sons along with all his gifts. The gene seed of Magnus was extraordinary in many ways, conveying to those who bore it a psychic sensitivity and potential that far exceeded what any other legion could claim. To be a Thousand Sun was to be touched by something vast and strange, to carry within yourself a connection to the immaterial realm that made you both more than human and, in certain terrible ways, less stable than human. Because alongside the gifts came something else. Something that had no proper name for a long time, that manifested without warning and without mercy and without any discernible pattern that could be used to predict or prevent it. The warriors of the Thousand Suns began to change. Not in the gradual and manageable way that all space marines changed over time, their bodies slowly adapting and growing in response to the demands placed upon them. This was something different. Something violent and uncontrolled, and deeply fundamentally wrong. Flesh would run and shift. Bones would lengthen or multiply or simply cease to maintain their proper shape. A warrior who had been a man would become, in the space of hours or days, something that no longer resembled a man in any meaningful sense. It was called the flesh change, and it was, without exaggeration, the most horrifying thing that Magnus had ever witnessed. These were his sons. And they were being consumed from within by the very gift that was supposed to make them exceptional. 60 years. That is the span of time that Magnus devoted to the search for a cure, and to understand what that number means you have to hold it against the scale of his other achievements and the pace at which a being of his nature typically moved through the world. Magnus was not a patient man by temperament. He was a man of sweeping vision and decisive action, a thinker who saw answers where others saw only questions and who moved quickly once a course of action became clear to him. But the flesh change defeated him, again and again, for 6 decades. He pursued every avenue of conventional biological science that the Imperium's considerable knowledge could offer, and found nothing that worked. He consulted with the Mechanicum and with the apothecaries of other legions, enduring the discomfort of exposing his legion's weakness to outside scrutiny because the alternative was to let his sons die. He dug into the ancient lore that lined the libraries of Tizca, searching for precedents and parallels in the long history of human psychic development. He found partial answers, temporary measures, ways of slowing the progression of the mutation in individual cases, but nothing that addressed the root of the problem. Nothing that would stop it. And all the while his sons continued to change, continued to be lost, continued to fall away from themselves in ways that no amount of psychic power or scholarly brilliance could prevent. It was desperation that drove Magnus to the bargain, and it is important to say that plainly and without softening it, because the desperation was real and it was earned. 60 years of failure. 60 years of watching sons he loved dissolve into something beyond saving. 60 years of applying the full force of the greatest intellect in the Immaterium to a problem that refused to yield. When a man of that intelligence and that power reaches the end of what conventional means can accomplish, the temptation to look elsewhere becomes something more than temptation. It becomes a kind of moral imperative, the sense that to refuse any remaining option is itself a form of abandonment. Magnus looked elsewhere. He reached into the warp, into the deep and dangerous places he had spent his life studying, and he made contact with something there. A powerful entity, a being of the immaterial realm whose nature and whose true name are matters of considerable and deliberate obscurity in the accounts that survive. What is clear is that a bargain was struck. Magnus offered something of himself, something irreplaceable and precious, as the price of the knowledge or the power he needed. He offered his eye. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. He gave up, in the most literal sense, one of the two windows through which he perceived the world, surrendering it into the keeping of something that had no human understanding of what such a sacrifice meant, or perhaps understood it all too well. The flesh change stopped. After 60 years of inexorable progression, of losses that had carved deep scars into the culture and the morale of the Thousand Sons, the mutation simply ceased. The warriors who remained were stable. New recruits no longer faced the terrible lottery of whether their own gene seed would eventually turn against them. The Legion was saved, and Magnus had saved it, and for a time there was something in Tizca that might have been described as joy, or at least as the profound and exhausted relief of people who have lived too long under a sentence they had come to believe was inevitable. But the price of that salvation was not simply the eye that Magnus had given. The price extended further, into dimensions that Magnus, for all his extraordinary perceptiveness, did not fully see at the time. The entity with whom he had bargained was not a neutral party, not a simple trader of power for power operating without agenda or interest beyond the transaction itself. In the vast and endlessly complicated politics of the warp, nothing was ever simply what it appeared to be, and no bargain was ever truly complete at the moment of its making. Magnus had purchased his Legion's survival with a coin whose full value he did not yet understand, and the interest on that debt was still accumulating, quietly and invisibly, in the dark places where such things are tallied. The consequences would not reveal themselves all at once. They would unfold over years and decades, and when they finally became visible, they would be unlike anything Magnus had imagined he was agreeing to. Power beyond mortal limits. To speak of Magnus in battle is to speak of something that sits uncomfortably at the boundary between military history and myth. Other Primarchs were devastating in combat certainly. Angron was an engine of destruction without equal in close quarters. Sanguinius was a warrior of breathtaking grace and lethal precision. Horus at his peak was perhaps the most complete martial being the Immaterium had ever produced. But Magnus in battle was something categorically different from all of them, something that did not fit neatly into the language of swords and guns and the physical exchange of force that defined conventional warfare. When Magnus unleashed his psychic power against an enemy force, the result was not combat in any recognizable sense. It was devastation. Armies that had held their ground against everything the Great Crusade could throw at them, fortified positions that had resisted orbital bombardment and massed Astartes assault alike, simply ceased to be coherent fighting forces when Magnus turned his attention to them. He did not need to move through their lines, did not need to engage them in the push and pull of contested ground. He could reach into the substance of what they were, into the psychic and material reality of soldiers and vehicles and emplacements, and unmake them with a focused act of will that left no room for resistance or retreat. Witnesses described the experience of watching Magnus in full psychic assault as something that bypassed the rational mind entirely and struck directly at the most primitive and wordless parts of human consciousness, the parts that recognized, without needing to be told, that they were in the presence of something utterly beyond their capacity to oppose. One of the qualities that made Magnus so uniquely formidable as a military force was the simple fact that his reach was not limited by the same constraints that bound every other weapon in the Imperium's arsenal. A bolter required line of sight. A battle tank required roads or terrain that could bear its weight. Even the most devastating orbital strike required the target to be located, confirmed, and struck before it could move or respond. Magnus required none of these things. His psychic power could extend outward from his physical position across distances that had no meaningful parallel in conventional warfare, reaching enemies who believed themselves safely beyond the range of any threat, who had placed geography and distance between themselves and the thousand suns with the reasonable expectation that such separation would protect them. It did not. Magnus could feel the presence of minds across immense distances in the way that a skilled musician can hear a note played in an adjacent room, not clearly at first, but unmistakably, and with sufficient attention, with perfect precision. And what he could feel, he could reach. The psychological effect of this on enemy forces, once it became known, was considerable and demoralizing in ways that went beyond the purely physical losses it caused. To know that distance offered no safety, that there was no position you could occupy that placed you beyond the attention of the Crimson King, was to fight with a weight upon the mind that no amount of training or discipline could entirely remove. But even the ability to devastate armies at range, extraordinary as it was, does not fully capture what Magnus could do when he brought his power to bear on the world itself rather than simply on the living beings within it. Magnus could bend reality. This is not a poetic exaggeration or a loose metaphor for very impressive psychic effects. It is a description of something that witnesses recorded in the most literal terms available to them, an observation that the world, in the immediate vicinity of Magnus at full power, did not always behave as the world was supposed to behave. The laws that governed the behavior of matter and energy, the reliable and consistent rules that made the physical universe navigable and predictable, became, in his presence, something more like suggestions. Light moved differently around him. Space itself seemed to flex and distort, distances expanding or contracting in ways that had no physical explanation. Objects moved without being touched. Structures that should have stood fell, and things that should have fallen stood, because Magnus had decided it would be so, and the universe, in its immediate vicinity, lacked the capacity to disagree with him. Those who witnessed this and survived it almost universally described the experience in terms that reached for religious or mythological language, because the secular vocabulary of the material world simply did not contain adequate words for what they had seen. They had watched a man argue with reality and win. The physical form of Magnus was itself a weapon of a particularly unsettling kind, because it was not fixed in the way that the physical forms of ordinary beings were fixed. Magnus could alter his size, expanding to dimensions that dwarfed even his already extraordinary natural stature, filling a space with his presence in a way that was as much psychic as it was physical, that made the air itself feel heavier and the light feel different and the ground beneath him feel uncertain. He could, conversely, render himself invisible, not merely difficult to see but genuinely absent from the perceptions of those around him, his vast psychic signature somehow folded inward and contained so completely that even other psychers struggled to locate him. Perhaps most unsettling of all, he could exist partially outside of normal space, occupying a liminal position between the material world and the warp that made him effectively impossible to engage by conventional means. A blade that passed through him in one moment might find solid flesh in the next, or might find nothing at all, or might find something that was neither flesh nor absence but something in between that the hand holding the blade was not equipped to process. To fight Magnus was to fight a problem that kept changing its own terms, that refused to remain the kind of problem that training and experience and courage could reliably solve. It demanded something else, something that most warriors simply did not possess and could not quickly acquire. There are accounts of individuals who encountered Magnus in person, who stood in the same space as him and experienced his full and undimmed presence, and who were broken by it. Not physically. Not through any deliberate act of aggression on his part. Simply broken, in the way that a vessel is broken when you pour into it more than it was designed to hold. Men and women of genuine courage, people who had faced the horrors of the warp and the brutality of alien warfare without flinching, found themselves overwhelmed in his presence in ways they could not fully explain or control. Some were struck with awe, so complete that it passed through wonder and came out the other side as something closer to terror, the feeling of standing before something so far beyond you that the very concept of your own agency became temporarily meaningless. Some wept, without knowing why, the way people sometimes weep when confronted with beauty too large for them to contain within their ordinary emotional range. Some simply could not look at him directly and found their eyes sliding away from him, the way eyes slide away from a source of light too bright to meet. Magnus was not, in most of these accounts, doing anything intentional to produce these effects. He was simply present. And his presence, unmediated and undisguised, was more than the ordinary human nervous system was constructed to receive. To add another layer of strangeness to an already extraordinary existence, the appearance of Magnus was not entirely consistent across the accounts of those who witnessed him. This was not a matter of poor observation or failing memory. It was something more deliberate and more fundamental than that. Magnus seemed, to different observers in the same moment, to look different. Not dramatically, not in ways that suggested an outright illusion, but in the subtler and more troubling sense that the impression he left on the mind did not reduce to a single stable image. Some saw a scholar, a man of gravity and deep thoughtfulness whose physical power was almost secondary to the quality of focused intelligence that poured from him. Others saw something far less human, something older and stranger, a figure that wore the shape of a man the way a force of nature might wear it, provisionally and without complete conviction. His coloring shifted between accounts. His single eye appeared differently, sometimes as an injury, sometimes as a window, sometimes as something that had no comfortable analogy in ordinary human experience. This inconsistency of appearance was not weakness or instability. It was, in its own way, a kind of truth. Magnus was genuinely all of these things simultaneously, and different observers, bringing different perceptions and different fears and different capacities for understanding to the encounter, simply saw whichever aspect of him their minds were best equipped to receive. In time, those who studied Magnus and those who followed him and those who feared him, came to understand that he was not simply a powerful individual, operating within the normal framework of cause and effect, that governed the lives of even the most extraordinary beings. He was something else. Something that the language of individual agency did not quite capture. He was a nexus, a point in the fabric of reality where enormous forces converged and concentrated and expressed themselves through a single, conscious form. Psychic energy gathered around him, the way weather gathers around certain geographic features, not randomly, but because the shape of what he was, created the conditions for it. Fate seemed to organize itself around him, significant events clustering in his vicinity with a frequency that exceeded any statistical expectation, as though the universe itself recognized that where Magnus was, things of consequence were going to happen. Sorcery, in his hands, was not a set of techniques or a collection of learned abilities but a natural expression of what he fundamentally was, as inseparable from him as sight is from an eye, or sound is from a voice. Those who came to know him well, stopped thinking of him as a man with extraordinary powers and began thinking of him as something more like a living principle, an embodiment of what psychic potential, taken to its furthest possible expression, actually looked like when it walked the earth and drew breath and turned its single blazing eye upon the world. The fatal flaw. The Great Crusade was, in its broadest conception, a project of unity. The Emperor's vision was of a humanity brought together under a single banner, its ancient divisions of culture and belief and practice dissolved into a common identity defined by reason, by progress, and by the shared endeavor of survival in a hostile universe. It was a vision of extraordinary ambition, and for a time it seemed as though it might actually be achieved. But unity, even among beings of superhuman capability and shared purpose, is a fragile thing, and the cracks that would eventually bring the whole edifice down did not appear suddenly or without warning. They grew slowly, deepening over years, along lines that were visible to anyone who cared to look. And one of the deepest and most consequential of those lines ran directly through the question of psychic power, and of Magnus, and of what his example meant for the future of the Imperium he was helping to build. The other Primarchs were not a monolithic group in their opinions on any subject, and certainly not on this one. But many of them were made deeply uncomfortable by Magnus and by the Thousand Sons, by the openness with which they practiced their psychic arts, by the pride with which they displayed abilities that most of the Imperium had been carefully taught to regard with fear and suspicion. This discomfort was not simply ignorance or prejudice, though it was sometimes that as well. It was, in some cases, a genuine and considered concern about the direction in which Magnus's example seemed to be pointing, and about what would happen to the Imperium if that direction was followed without limit or restraint. The discomfort and the arguments and the long accumulating tension over the use of psychic powers and sorcery within the legions eventually reached a point at which the Emperor felt compelled to act. He called a council, a gathering of Primarchs and legion representatives and figures from across the Imperium's leadership, on a world called Nicaea. It was one of the most significant formal assemblies of the entire Great Crusade era, a moment at which the question that had been circling through the corridors of power for years was finally brought into the open and given a formal hearing. Arguments were made on both sides. Advocates for the continued and open use of psychic abilities within the legions made their case with passion and with considerable force, drawing on evidence of the genuine military and strategic value that librarians and psychers had provided across countless campaigns. Those who opposed them, Primarchs like Mortarion and Leman Russ, who had their own deep and personal reasons for distrusting the warp and everything connected to it, argued with equal force that the risks were too great, the dangers too unpredictable, the potential for catastrophic loss of control too real to be managed simply by confidence and good intentions. Magnus himself spoke at Nicaea, and spoke brilliantly, as he did everything. But the Emperor listened to all of it, weighed it all, and then delivered his judgment. The use of sorcery within the legions was to be restricted. Librarians were to be sanctioned and controlled. The open and unregulated practice that had characterized the Thousand Sons was to end. The Emperor's ruling at Nicaea was clear. It was delivered with the full authority of the Master of Mankind and the Father of the Primarchs, which meant that it carried a weight that no son of the Emperor could simply ignore without consequence. Most of the legions accepted it, some readily, some with reluctance, but accepted it nonetheless. Magnus did not. This is not to say that he stood up in the immediate aftermath of the council and announced his defiance in plain terms. It was subtler than that, and in its subtlety perhaps more revealing of his true character than an open rebellion would have been. Magnus continued his studies. Behind the walls of Tizca, in the deep libraries and hidden chambers that formed the inner heart of the Thousand Sons world, the work went on. The research into the warp, the exploration of forbidden lore, the psychic practices that Nicaea had specifically been convened to restrict, none of it stopped. It simply became quieter, less visible to outside eyes, more carefully contained within the boundaries of Prospero, where the Emperor's long reach was still present but where the daily oversight that might have caught and interrupted it was absent. Magnus told himself, as people who continue doing what they have been told to stop almost always tell themselves, that there were good reasons for this. That the Emperor's ruling had been a political necessity, a concession to the fears of lesser minds, and that the work itself remained as important and as justified as it had always been. That he, of all people, could be trusted to pursue it responsibly. At the center of Magnus's refusal to accept the restrictions of Nicaea was a belief about himself that had been growing for years, quietly and steadily, alongside his genuine achievements and his genuine wisdom, like a weed growing in the shadow of a great tree. He had accumulated, over the course of his long life, an extraordinary amount of evidence that he was exceptionally capable. This was not a delusion. It was simply true. He had done things that no other being of his era could have done. He had understood things that others could not even perceive. He had navigated the warp with a confidence and a precision that had repeatedly proved justified by outcomes. Every time he had trusted his own judgment over the conventional wisdom of those around him, every time he had pressed further into dangerous territory than others would have dared, he had come back with something valuable, something that validated the risk he had taken. Over decades, this accumulated track record had produced in him a conviction that was both understandable and fatal. He had come to believe that the rules which existed to protect other people from the dangers of the warp did not apply to him in quite the same way. That his knowledge and his discipline and his sheer psychic power placed him in a category where the normal calculus of risk and caution needed to be recalibrated. That he could safely go where others could not, and master what others feared, and return whole from encounters that would have destroyed lesser minds entirely. Pride is a word that appears again and again in any honest account of Magnus the Red, and it is important to be precise about what kind of pride it was, because not all pride is the same thing and the distinctions matter enormously when you are trying to understand how one of the most gifted beings in the history of the Imperium came to ruin. Magnus was not vain in the small and petty sense. He did not seek flattery or require admiration in the way that insecure people seek and require them. He did not surround himself with those who would tell him only what he wanted to hear, or dismiss criticism simply because it was unwelcome. He was, in many respects, a man of genuine intellectual humility, capable of acknowledging error and updating his understanding in the light of new evidence. But there was a level at which something harder and less flexible had taken root. A certainty about his own exceptional nature that was no longer being tested against evidence in the rigorous way that his scholarly principles demanded it should be. He had stopped, somewhere along the way, fully applying to himself the same critical scrutiny he applied to everything else. His pride was not the pride of a fool who does not know his limits. It was the pride of a genius who had genuinely transcended most limits and had, in doing so, lost the ability to clearly perceive the ones that remained. That distinction did not make the outcome any less devastating. In some ways it made it more so, because it meant that the flaw was buried so deeply within his greatest strengths that separating one from the other was, in the end, impossible. The warning that doomed everything. Among all the terrible ironies that define the story of Magnus the Red, perhaps the most devastating is this. He saw it coming. In the years before the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart and set brother against brother in a war whose wounds have never fully healed, Magnus looked into the currents of the warp with his extraordinary psychic sight and perceived what was unfolding in the shadows of the Great Crusade. He saw the corruption that had taken root in Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's most beloved and most trusted son. He saw the shape of what was being planned, the scale of the betrayal that was being prepared, the catastrophic violence that would follow when it finally broke into the open. He saw, in other words, the single most important thing that anyone in the Imperium needed to know, the information that, had it reached the right ears at the right moment, might have changed everything. The vision did not come to him as a comfortable or abstract piece of foreknowledge, neatly packaged and easy to interpret. Psychic sight rarely worked that cleanly, and Magnus knew better than most how easily the signals of the warp could be misread or misunderstood. But what he saw was clear enough, vivid enough, sufficiently coherent in its terrible implications, that he could not persuade himself it was merely a phantom or a misinterpretation. Horus was going to betray the Emperor. The heresy was coming. And Magnus, alone among all the Primarchs, knew it before it happened. The knowledge created an immediate and agonizing problem. Magnus had seen the betrayal. He needed to warn the Emperor. But the means available to him for doing so were constrained in ways that made a straightforward communication almost impossible. He could not simply travel to Terra in time to make the warning meaningful. The distances involved, and the timescales on which the events he had foreseen were moving, made physical travel inadequate. Conventional astropathic communication was, in his assessment, too slow and too uncertain, too vulnerable to interception or distortion in the warp. He needed something faster and more direct, something that could place his warning in the Emperor's mind with the speed and the clarity that the situation demanded. He turned to what he knew. He turned to the warp, and to the most powerful psychic ritual he had ever attempted, a working of such enormous scope and ambition that it would have been beyond any other psyker in the Immaterium to even conceive of it, let alone execute. He gathered his power, and the power of his most gifted sons, and he reached across the immeasurable distance between Prospero and Terra through the immaterial realm, forcing a channel open by sheer force of will and psychic might, and he sent his warning through it. The message reached the Emperor. On that point the accounts are consistent. Magnus succeeded in what he set out to do. The warning was delivered. And in delivering it, he triggered a catastrophe that dwarfed the very betrayal he was trying to prevent. Beneath the surface of Terra, in secret so complete that only the Emperor and a handful of the most trusted individuals in the entire Imperium knew of its existence, a project of staggering ambition had been underway for years. The Emperor, in the vast and patient way that characterized his longest and deepest plans, had been working to reclaim and repurpose the ancient network of tunnels and passages built by the alien Eldar race, a system of pathways through a dimension adjacent to the warp that offered travel and communication without the dangers and the unpredictability of the warp itself. This was the Webway project, and it represented, in the Emperor's vision, the foundation of a future in which humanity could move between the stars, without exposing itself to the horrors of the immaterial realm. It was delicate work, requiring the Emperor's constant and focused personal attention to maintain the psychic barriers that kept the project's tunnels free from warp contamination. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of undertaking that could not survive a sudden and massive uncontrolled surge of psychic energy, passing through the warp in its vicinity. Magnus's ritual, vast and powerful and entirely unannounced, struck those barriers like a wave strikes a wall of sand. The protections that the Emperor had spent years constructing and maintaining were breached in an instant. The carefully sealed tunnels of the Webway were cracked open. And through those cracks, the things that live in the warp began to pour. The consequences of what Magnus's ritual had done, unfolded with a speed and a violence that left no room for denial or minimization. Demonic entities, beings of the warp given form and direction by their own terrible natures, flooded into the breached sections of the Webway in numbers that demanded an immediate and massive military response. The Emperor was forced to abandon his work on the project entirely, redirecting his attention and his psychic power to the task of containing the invasion and preventing it from spreading further. Warriors of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard and among the finest fighters in the Imperium, were deployed into the Webway to hold back the tide, fighting in conditions of almost unimaginable horror against enemies that most soldiers would never encounter in a lifetime of war. They held, but only barely, and only at a cost in lives and effort that would not have been necessary if the breach had never happened. The webway project itself was effectively finished. Years of careful, painstaking, irreplaceable work, the foundation of what the Emperor had intended to be one of the greatest gifts he would ever give to humanity, was destroyed in the time it took Magnus to send a message. The vision of a future in which humanity traveled safely between the stars, free from the predations of the warp, died in that moment. It has never been recovered. The Immaterium that exists today, dependent on the dangerous and unreliable methods of warp travel that the webway was designed to supersede, is in part a monument to what was lost in that single catastrophic instant. The Emperor's response to what Magnus had done was shaped by grief and fury in proportions that are difficult to fully untangle at this distance. He had lost something irreplaceable. He had lost years of work and the future that work was meant to enable, and he had lost it not to an enemy, not to the malice of chaos or the aggression of an alien race, but to the actions of his own son, acting with the best of intentions and the worst of judgment. The order that he issued in the aftermath was unambiguous. Magnus was to be brought back to Terra. The accounts differ on the precise nature of the original instruction, on whether the Emperor intended censure and correction or something more severe, on whether what was ordered was a return or an arrest or something that occupied the difficult space between the two. What is clear is that the Emperor was not, in that moment, thinking primarily about mercy. He was thinking about consequences, about accountability, about the fact that Magnus had broken something that could not be unbroken and had done so in defiance of principles that the Emperor had spent considerable effort trying to establish. The instruction went out from Terra and began its journey towards the ears of those who would be tasked with carrying it out. And the story of how that instruction was received, and by whom, and what was decided in response to it, is where the tragedy of Magnus the Red moves from the painful into the irreversible. The burning of Prospero. The Emperor's order to bring Magnus back to Terra passed through channels that were not neutral, and arrived in the hands of a man who was not inclined towards restraint. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, was in many respects everything that Magnus was not. Where Magnus was a scholar and a philosopher, a man who approached the world through the lens of accumulated knowledge and careful reasoning, Russ was a warrior in the most elemental sense, a being who understood the world through action and instinct and the direct and unmediated application of force. The two Primarchs had never been close. Their natures were too different, their values too opposed, their visions of what a Space Marine Legion should be, too fundamentally at odds for genuine warmth or understanding to develop between them. Russ had been among the most vocal critics of Magnus and the Thousand Sons, among those who had pushed hardest at Nicaea for the restrictions on psychic practice that Magnus had subsequently ignored. When the order to retrieve Magnus reached him, there is considerable debate among those who have studied this period, about what exactly he was told, and what authority he was given to act as he chose. What is not debated is what he did with that authority. He gathered his legion, the Space Wolves, warriors of ferocious capability and absolute loyalty to their Primarch, and he set course for Prospero. He did not go to negotiate. He did not go to escort. He went to destroy. What followed has come down through the long and painful history of the Immaterium under a name that carries within it everything you need to know about its nature and its outcome. The burning of Prospero. Not the Battle of Prospero, which would imply a contest of uncertain result. Not the Siege of Prospero, which would suggest a prolonged and structured military engagement. The burning. A word that speaks of something final and consuming, something that does not leave the object of its attention diminished but changed in kind, reduced to a state from which there is no meaningful recovery. The Space Wolves came to Prospero with the full weight of a legion at war, supported by forces of the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, whose particular abilities made them uniquely effective against the psychic warriors of the Thousand Sons. Tizca, the city of wonders that Magnus had spent decades building into a monument to everything he believed, the libraries and academies and observatories that housed the greatest collection of knowledge in the Imperium outside of Terra itself, burned. The towers fell. The accumulated wisdom of generations, texts and artifacts and records that could never be replaced, were consumed by fire or buried in rubble or simply lost in the chaos of a battle that left no room for preservation or mercy. Prospero, which had been one of the most beautiful and most intellectually remarkable worlds in the Imperium, was being unmade, and Magnus watched it happen. To be a witness to the destruction of everything you have built and everything you love, while possessing the power that Magnus possessed, is a particular and exquisite form of torture. He could see what was happening to Prospero. He could see his city burning and his sons dying and the work of decades being reduced to ash and ruin by warriors who had been his brothers in purpose if never quite in spirit. And he could fight. He did fight. The 1,000 Sons, for all the devastation being visited upon them, were not simply victims. They were psychic warriors of extraordinary capability, and they met the Space Wolves with everything they had, contesting every street and every chamber and every burning corridor of Tizca with a ferocity born of the knowledge that there was nothing left to retreat to, nothing beyond Prospero worth saving if Prospero itself was gone. But the numbers were against them, and the Sisters of Silence, whose psychic blankness made them uniquely terrible opponents for the sorceress warriors of the 1,000 Sons, cut through their defenses in ways that conventional opposition could not have managed. Magnus watched his legion bleed. He watched his world die. And he understood, with a clarity that his psychic sight made inescapable, that this was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected, not a mistake that could be walked back through explanation and diplomacy. This was the end of what Prospero had been. At some point in the chaos and the fire, Magnus and Leman Russ found each other, and what followed was one of the most devastating single combats in the history of the Primarchs. These were not ordinary beings meeting in ordinary conflict. They were two of the most physically and psychically powerful individuals the human race had ever produced, and they brought everything they were to the encounter, with a totality that left the ground around them cratered and broken, and the air itself feeling damaged. Russ was a warrior without equal in close combat, a fighter of instinctive and overwhelming ferocity whose physical power was matched by a speed and a tactical intelligence that belied the wild and savage impression he sometimes chose to display. Magnus was a psychic force of almost incomprehensible magnitude, capable of reshaping reality itself when he reached his full power. Between them they should have been evenly matched, or close enough to it that the outcome could not be predicted. But Magnus, in the accounts that survive, did not fight at his full capacity. Whether through grief, or through some residual reluctance to fully commit to violence against a brother, or through the simple devastating weight of everything that was happening around him, he did not bring his complete power to bear. Russ had no such hesitation. The wounds Magnus suffered in that duel were terrible, the kind that would have killed an ordinary being several times over, and even for a Primarch they represented damage on a scale that demanded an immediate response or an end. The response that Magnus chose was not conventional, and it was not small. Faced with annihilation, with his legion being destroyed around him and his own body carrying wounds that would have felled almost any other being, Magnus reached into himself and into the warp and performed a working of sorcery whose scale and ambition had no real precedent in the history of the 1,000 Sons. He gathered what remained of his power, and the power of his surviving sons, and he tore open a passage through the immaterial realm with a force of will that was as much desperation as it was skill. It was not a clean or precise piece of psychic craft in the way that his greatest workings had always been clean and precise. It was raw and enormous and driven by the purest possible form of need, the need to survive, to preserve what little remained of what he had built and what he loved. The ritual demanded everything he had, and it took everything he had, and in the taking it left marks on him that went beyond the physical wounds Russ had inflicted, marks on the deeper substance of what he was, that would shape everything that came after. But it worked. In the burning ruins of Tizca, as the space wolves pressed in from every side, Magnus opened a door in reality and led his surviving sons through it, away from Prospero and away from the Immaterium and into the vast and terrible landscape of the Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror is a place where the boundary between the material universe and the warp has collapsed entirely, where reality and unreality coexist in a state of permanent and churning instability that makes it simultaneously one of the most dangerous and one of the most strange places in the known galaxy. It was not a refuge in any comfortable sense. It was not a safe harbor or a place of healing where Magnus and his sons could rest and recover and take stock of what had happened to them. It was a wound in space, a scar left by ancient catastrophe, and to make it your home was to accept a kind of existence that had no real parallel in the material world. But it was away from Prospero. It was away from the space wolves and the fire and the sound of his city burning. And for Magnus, in those first moments after the ritual, away was enough. It had to be enough, because there was nothing else left. The 1,000 sons who survived the burning of Prospero were a fraction of what they had been, a remnant carried through the eye of a psychic storm by a Primarch who had spent himself nearly to nothing in the effort of saving them. They were alive. Prospero was not. And the universe into which they had emerged was one in which the path back to what they had been was not merely difficult but, as Magnus was only beginning to understand, permanently and irrevocably closed. What the burning of Prospero did to Magnus at the level of belief and faith and the fundamental orientation of his soul, is perhaps the most important and the most consequential thing it did to him, more important even than the physical destruction it caused. Magnus had always had a complicated relationship with the Emperor and with the Immaterium. He had disagreed with both, had pushed against the restrictions they placed on him, had pursued his own course in the conviction that his judgment was sound and his intentions pure. But underneath all of that disagreement and all of that independence, there had been something that held. A fundamental belief that the Emperor was, at some level, on the right side of things. That the Immaterium, for all its flaws and its fear and its willingness to destroy what it did not understand, was at least pointing in a direction worth following. The burning of Prospero broke that belief. Not bent it. Broke it. Magnus had tried to warn the Emperor. He had risked everything to send a warning that might have saved millions of lives, and the response had been to send a legion to destroy his world. Whatever the precise sequence of orders and decisions and miscommunications that had produced that outcome, the outcome itself was undeniable. His city was ash. His sons were dead or scattered. And the farther he had reached across the void to warn had not protected him. What comes after the breaking of faith in a being of Magnus's nature and Magnus's power is not grief alone, though there was grief, enormous and consuming and entirely justified. It is also rage. And beneath the rage, or perhaps alongside it, something colder and more deliberate, a reassessment of the world and his place in it that led him, step by step and choice by choice, to conclusions that the Magnus of Prospero, the scholar king in his tower of knowledge, would have found unthinkable. He had served the Emperor. He had built a legion in the Emperor's name, and fought campaigns across the galaxy in the Emperor's cause, and sacrificed his eye and 60 years of searching to protect his sons, and had done all of this in the genuine belief that it was the right thing to do. And the Emperor had sent Leman Russ to burn his home. The logic of that experience, as Magnus processed it in the howling unreality of the Eye of Terror with the ruins of everything he had loved still present in his mind with perfect psychic clarity, pointed in only one direction. If the Emperor was not what Magnus had believed him to be, then the war that was coming, the war that Horus had begun and that was already reshaping the galaxy, was not the simple contest between loyalty and betrayal that most of those who fought in it understood it to be. Magnus turned. Not quickly, and not without pain, but completely. He turned away from the Emperor and towards the only future that seemed to remain open to him now, and in doing so he completed the transformation from the Crimson King of Prospero into something older and darker and far more dangerous. The fall to chaos. The relationship between Magnus and Tzinch did not begin at the burning of Prospero, though that catastrophe accelerated and deepened it beyond any point of return. It had been growing for far longer, threading itself through the history of Magnus's life with the patient and almost invisible care that characterizes everything Tzinch touches. Tzinch is the chaos god of change and knowledge, of manipulation and sorcery, of the endless and intoxicating pursuit of understanding for its own sake, and of the labyrinthine plots that fold back upon themselves so completely that even their architect cannot always say with certainty where intention ends and accident begins. He is, of all the dark powers of the warp, the one whose nature most closely mirrors certain qualities of Magnus himself: the hunger for knowledge, the fascination with the hidden patterns beneath the surface of reality, the conviction that understanding is the highest possible achievement of a conscious mind. This is not coincidence. Tzinch does not deal in coincidence. The parallels between his nature and Magnus's were, from a certain perspective, the most carefully constructed trap in the history of the warp, a lure built not from crude temptation but from the much more sophisticated and much harder to resist appeal of recognition. Magnus, encountering the domain of Tzinch in his studies of the warp, did not find something alien and threatening. He found something that felt, in certain lights and at certain angles, uncomfortably like a reflection. And reflections, for a being as self-aware and as intellectually curious as Magnus, were almost impossible to look away from. When Magnus was cast into the Eye of Terror after the burning of Prospero, the trauma of what he had endured and the enormous psychic expenditure of the ritual that had carried his sons to safety, combined to produce an effect that had no real precedent in the known history of Primarchs or Psykers. His soul, that vast and complex and extraordinarily powerful psychic presence that had always been both his greatest gift and his greatest vulnerability, could not hold itself together under the weight of what had happened to it. It fractured. The single coherent identity that had been Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the scholar of Prospero, broke apart into countless individual fragments, each one carrying some portion of what he had been, some aspect of his personality or his memory or his power, but none of them containing the whole. It was, in its way, a death, though not the clean and final kind that ends suffering and closes accounts. It was a death that left the pieces behind, scattered across the immaterial landscape of the Eye of Terror like shards of a broken mirror, each one still reflecting something of the original image but none of them capable, alone, of showing you what the complete picture had looked like. The Magnus who had stood in his library in Tizca and believed that knowledge could save the world was gone. What remained was a collection of fragments, brilliant and powerful and deeply damaged, waiting in the warp to be gathered back together, if such a thing was even possible. The 1,000 sons who had survived the burning of Prospero and followed their Primarch into the Eye of Terror did not abandon him in his shattered state. They could not. He was the reason they existed, the mind that had shaped everything they were, the being around whom their entire culture and identity had been constructed. To abandon him would have been to abandon the last coherent remnant of what Prospero had meant, to surrender the final thread connecting them to the world and the purpose they had lost. And so they searched. Across the howling and impossible landscape of the Eye of Terror, through regions of the warp where reality operated according to rules that shifted from moment to moment and where the very concept of navigation required a kind of psychic attunement that even veteran Thousand Sons warriors found deeply taxing, they gathered the fragments of their Primarch. It was not a swift process. It could not be. The fragments did not wait obediently to be found. They drifted, some of them, deeper into the immaterial realm, carried by the currents of the warp to places that required extraordinary effort to reach. Others were, in their fragmented state, actively dangerous, carrying enough of Magnus's raw power to be hazardous to those who approached them without sufficient care and preparation. The recovery took years, and demanded of the 1,000 Sons a sustained act of devotion and courage that, in its own way, was as remarkable as anything they had achieved on the battlefields of the Great Crusade. What emerged from the long process of gathering and reconstitution was not precisely the Magnus who had been broken. It could not have been. You cannot shatter something of that complexity and delicacy and then reassemble the pieces without the cracks showing, without the joins between what was and what is remaining visible to anyone who knows where to look. The Magnus who came back together in the Eye of Terror was recognizably himself in the ways that mattered most, in his intelligence and his pride and his burning unquenchable need to understand and to act and to shape the world according to his own vision. But he was also different. The fracturing had changed him in ways that were both subtle and profound, had loosened certain connections and tightened others, had left him with a relationship to his own identity that was less stable and less continuous than it had been before Prospero. And into that instability, into the gaps left by the fracturing and the imperfect reconstitution, Tzinch moved. The chaos god of change and manipulation had been present throughout, patient in the way that only a being outside of time can be patient, waiting for the moment when the shape of Magnus's soul was fluid enough to be permanently altered. That moment had come. The embrace of Tzinch was not offered as corruption, or at least it did not feel like corruption from the inside. It felt like completion, like the final piece of a puzzle finding its place, like a door opening into a room that had always been there, waiting to be entered. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, scholar of Prospero, son of the Emperor, became a demon prince of Tzinch. This is one of the most significant and most sorrowful sentences in the history of the Horus heresy, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving past it, because the weight of what it means can be lost if you move through it too quickly. A demon prince is not simply a powerful servant of chaos. It is a being who has surrendered their fundamental nature as a material creature and accepted, in exchange for power and a kind of immortality, a permanent and irrevocable transformation into something that belongs wholly to the warp. Magnus had always existed on the boundary between the material and the immaterial. His psychic gifts had always meant that he was more present in the warp than ordinary beings, more connected to it, more shaped by it. But there had always been a boundary, a line between what he was and what the warp was, between the scholar and the subject of his study. In becoming a demon prince, that line was erased. Magnus crossed it completely and finally, and in crossing it became, in the most technical and the most philosophical sense, something other than human. Something other than what the Emperor had made him to be. The transformation was an ending and a beginning simultaneously, and neither the ending nor the beginning was anything that the Magnus of Prospero would have chosen, if he could have seen, in those early days of scholarship and wonder, where the road he was walking was eventually going to lead. The story of Magnus the Red is a tragedy, and it is important to be precise about what kind of tragedy it is, because not all tragedies are built the same way and the distinctions matter for what they ask of us in return. It is not the tragedy of a good man destroyed by evil forces from outside himself, though evil forces certainly played their part. It is not the tragedy of a weak man overwhelmed by temptations he lacked the strength to resist, because Magnus was not a weak man in any sense of the word. It is the tragedy of a great man destroyed by the very qualities that made him great, and that is the rarest and most painful kind, the kind that leaves you with no comfortable distance from which to observe it, no simple lesson to take away and apply elsewhere. His brilliance was real. His curiosity was genuine and admirable. His love for his sons was deep and self-sacrificing and expressed in actions of remarkable courage. His desire to understand the universe was not vanity or recklessness but the purest possible expression of what an intelligent being can aspire to. And every single one of these qualities, in the specific circumstances of his specific life, contributed directly to his ruin. The brilliance became pride. The curiosity became the inability to accept limits that existed for good reasons. The love for his sons drove him to a bargain whose consequences he could not control. The desire to understand led him deeper and deeper into territory that, in the end, understood him far better than he ever understood it. There is a version of Magnus's story in which small things go differently and the outcome changes completely. In which he heeds the warnings at Nicaea with genuine rather than performative acceptance. In which he finds another way to send his warning to the Emperor, or trusts the astropaths and accepts the delay. In which he recognizes, at some crucial moment, that his pride has compromised his judgment and pulls back from the edge before it is too late. These versions exist as possibilities, and they are worth acknowledging, because they illuminate what was not inevitable about what happened. Magnus was not destined to fall. He was not written into damnation from the moment of his creation, not a tragedy waiting passively for its appointed conclusion. He made choices, real choices, at every significant junction of his story, and the choices he made were shaped by virtues as much as by flaws, by love as much as by arrogance. That is what makes his story so difficult to look away from, and so difficult to find peace with once you have looked. He was brilliant, and his brilliance was not enough. He was proud, and his pride was not entirely unjustified, only insufficient to the scale of what he was facing. He desired to save the people he loved, and in that desire he found the instrument of their destruction. The Crimson King of Prospero burned, in the end, in a fire he had spent his whole life studying, never quite believing that it could consume him. The Siege of Terra. When the forces of Horus finally arrived at Terra and the siege of the imperial palace began, Magnus was among them. This fact alone carries an enormous weight of meaning, because it represents the completion of a journey that had begun in the libraries of Tizca and passed through the burning streets of Prospero and the howling unreality of the Eye of Terror before arriving, finally, at the walls of the place that had once represented everything Magnus had served. He had been to Terra before. He had communicated with the Emperor from across the vast distances of the galaxy, had felt the psychic presence of his father like a beacon in the warp, had oriented his entire early life around the knowledge that there was a being on that world who had made him and who represented, in some fundamental sense, the authority and the purpose behind everything the Thousand Suns did. Now he came back to Terra as an enemy. The palace that had once been the seat of the civilization he had fought to build was now a fortification to be breached, and Magnus brought to the task of breaching it the same extraordinary intelligence and psychic power that he had once devoted to the Emperor's cause, now redirected with a cold and purposeful fury, that made him among the most dangerous opponents the defenders of the palace would face across the entire length of the siege. He was not there because Horus commanded it, though Horus's command was the formal structure within which he operated. He was there because Terra was where the Emperor was, and the Emperor was what Magnus had come to address. The psychic assaults that Magnus led against the Imperial Palace during the siege were unlike anything the defenders had encountered before, which is a remarkable statement given the nature and the scale of the forces they were already facing. The palace had been designed to be the most defensible structure in the Immaterium, incorporating physical fortifications of extraordinary sophistication, alongside psychic defenses built and maintained by some of the most gifted minds the Emperor's service could produce. Against a conventional military force, even a very large and very capable one, it was designed to hold indefinitely. Against Magnus it was something different. He did not approach the palace's defenses as a soldier approaches a wall, looking for the weak points in the physical structure that can be exploited by conventional means. He approached them as a scholar approaches a problem, with patience and with the kind of analytical intelligence that can look at any system, no matter how complex, and find the principles underlying it. The psychic architecture of the palace's defenses was, to Magnus, a language. And he had spent his entire life learning languages of exactly this kind. He read the defenses as he read everything, with total comprehension, and what he could read he could dismantle. The assaults he led were not simply applications of raw power, though the raw power he brought to bear was itself almost incomprehensible in its scale. They were precise and informed and devastating in a way that pure force alone could never have achieved, the product of a mind that understood what it was attacking at the deepest possible level. But to frame Magnus's presence at the Siege of Terra, purely in terms of military objectives and tactical contributions to Horus's campaign, would be to misunderstand what he was actually doing there, and why. Magnus was not, at his deepest level of motivation, a servant of Horus. He had not fallen to chaos out of admiration for the War Master or belief in the cause that Horus claimed to represent. The heresy, in Magnus's experience of it, was not primarily a political or ideological conflict between competing visions for the future of the Imperium. It was personal. It had always been personal. The Emperor had sent Leman Russ to burn Prospero. The Emperor had allowed, or ordered, the destruction of everything Magnus had built and loved. The Emperor had responded to Magnus's desperate and costly warning with a violence that had shattered his legion and driven him into the arms of the very powers that the Emperor most feared. Whatever the precise sequence of decisions and miscommunications and manipulations that had produced that outcome, Magnus held the Emperor responsible for it, and the weight of that responsibility had not diminished in the years between Prospero and the siege. It had grown. It had hardened into something colder and more purposeful than the raw grief and rage of the immediate aftermath, into a settled and considered conviction that there was a reckoning due, and that Terra was where it would happen. Horus's war was, for Magnus, the vehicle for something that was ultimately between himself and his father, and no one else. Among the confrontations that marked the later stages of the siege, one stands out for what it reveals about what Magnus had become and what he retained of what he had always been. He encountered Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, one of the brothers who had remained loyal to the Emperor and who brought to the defense of Terra a physical power and a resilience that made him among the most formidable opponents the traitor forces would face. The confrontation between them was not simply a battle between two powerful beings on opposite sides of a war. It was a meeting of two Primarchs who had once been brothers, who had once shared the common purpose of the Great Crusade and the common identity of sons of the Emperor, now separated by the vast and unbridgeable gulf that the heresy had opened between the loyal and the damned. What passed between Magnus and Vulcan in the course of their confrontation carried the particular weight of all such meetings during the heresy, the awareness on both sides that what they were doing was not merely fighting but enacting something, performing the final and irrevocable confirmation of choices that had been made long before the first blow was struck. Magnus fought with everything he was. He had not diminished in power or in the terrible focused intelligence he brought to conflict. If anything, his ascension and his transformation had added dimensions to his capabilities that the Magnus of Prospero had not possessed. But against Vulcan he was reminded, perhaps, that power alone was never going to resolve what the heresy had ultimately become. Even in the midst of the Siege of Terra, even while conducting psychic assaults of enormous complexity against some of the most formidable defenses in the Imperium and pursuing the personal reckoning with the Emperor that had drawn him to Terra in the first place, Magnus did not cease to be the Primarch of the Thousand Sons. The role was too deeply embedded in what he was, too central to his identity across the long arc of his existence, to be set aside even in the extremity of what he was living through. He continued to command his legion through the siege, shaping their deployment and their tactics with the same careful and comprehensive intelligence that had always characterized his leadership of them. The Thousand Sons who fought at the Siege of Terra were not the same warriors who had studied in the libraries of Tizca, in the most literal sense as well as the metaphorical one. The mutations and transformations that had overtaken the Legion in the years since Prospero had changed many of them in ways that went far beyond the flesh change that Magnus had once spent 60 years trying to cure. But they remained his, and he remained theirs, and the bond between Primarch and Legion that had been forged on Prospero and tested by the burning and strained by the years in the Eye of Terror held, in its own damaged and altered form, through the fury of the siege. Magnus was shaping the destiny of the Thousand Sons even then, not just through the commands he gave on the battlefield but through the deeper choices he was making about what their future would look like and what it would mean to be a son of Magnus in the long darkness that was coming. The Demon King. When the Siege of Terra ended and the forces of Horus were broken and scattered, Magnus withdrew into the Eye of Terror and did not return in any sustained or direct sense for a very long time. The war had not given him what he had come to Terra to find. The Emperor lived, though in a condition that was its own kind of ending, entombed within the Golden Throne in a state that was neither life nor death but something in between that the Immaterium would spend 10,000 years learning to sustain and to venerate. The reckoning that Magnus had sought, the direct and final confrontation with his father that might have resolved something, answered something, closed something that had been left agonizingly open since Prospero, had not happened in the form he had imagined it. And so he went back into the warp, back into the Eye of Terror, back into the churning and impossible landscape that had become, by default and by necessity, the closest thing he had to a home. There, in the region of the Eye that the servants of Tizca had shaped to reflect the nature of their patron, Magnus found a world and made it his. The planet of the sorcerers it came to be called, a name that captured something of its nature without fully describing it, the way a single word can gesture towards a truth too large to be contained in language. It was where Magnus would rule for 10,000 years, and it was, in every important sense, the mirror image of everything that Prospero had been. The planet of the sorcerers was not a world in the conventional sense, not a sphere of rock and atmosphere orbiting a star according to the reliable and predictable laws of physics that govern the material universe. It was a world of the warp, shaped by psychic intention and maintained by sorceress will, and it bore the marks of that origin in every aspect of its existence. The geometry of it was wrong in ways that went beyond mere strangeness into something that actively resisted the attempts of ordinary minds to process it. Structures that should have been impossible by any material standard stood without apparent support, their angles describing relationships between planes and dimensions that had no names in conventional mathematics. Distances behaved unpredictably, corridors that appeared short revealing themselves to extend for miles, chambers that looked vast proving to be intimate when entered. The sky above it, if sky was even the right word for what existed above its towers and spires, shifted constantly, cycling through colors and configurations that corresponded to no natural phenomenon but instead seemed to reflect the mood and the focus of the being who ruled there. It was a place of endless sorcery, not in the sense that magic was performed there as a specific and deliberate act, though it was certainly that as well, but in the deeper sense that sorcery was the substance of which it was made, the principle by which it cohered and persisted, the air that its inhabitants breathed. To live on the planet of the sorcerers was to exist inside the working of a spell so large and so complex that its full scope could not be perceived from any single vantage point within it. But if the planet of the sorcerers gave Magnus a domain to rule and a throne from which to direct the continuing story of the Thousand Suns, it did not give him freedom in any meaningful sense, and as the millennia passed following the heresy, this truth became increasingly and uncomfortably apparent. Tizca was not a patron in the way that a human lord might be a patron, providing resources and protection in exchange for service while leaving the fundamental autonomy of the recipient intact. Tizca was a chaos god, a being whose nature was manipulation and change and the endless weaving of plots within plots, and the relationship between such a being and its greatest servant was not one of simple exchange but of something far more complex and far less comfortable. Magnus found, over time, that the choices available to him were not as open as they had appeared in the immediate aftermath of his ascension. That certain paths were closed, not by external prohibition but by the subtle and pervasive influence of a will greater than his own, a will that had been shaping his decisions and his desires for far longer than he had understood. Tizca did not command Magnus in crude and obvious ways. That was not how the architect of fate operated. Instead, the god of change arranged circumstances, created pressures, offered opportunities that pointed in certain directions and closed off others, until the choices that Magnus made began to feel less like the free exercise of his extraordinary intelligence and more like the following of a script whose author was not him. The 1,000 Suns endured. Through the long and terrible centuries following the heresy, through the exile and the mutation and the vast losses of Prospero and the siege, the legion that Magnus had built on a world of scholars and psychic warriors survived and persisted and continued to exist as a coherent fighting force under their Primarch's leadership. They were diminished. They were changed, in ways both literal and profound, by what they had been through and by the nature of the existence they now led within the Eye of Terror. The mutations that had afflicted them in the years after Prospero had in many cases advanced beyond anything that could be described as merely physical change, transforming warriors into beings whose relationship to their original human form was now a matter of theoretical continuity rather than visible resemblance. The rubric of Ahriman, a working of sorcery performed by the 1,000 Suns' greatest sorcerer in a desperate attempt to halt the mutations, had produced consequences as catastrophic in their own way as the bargain Magnus had struck to halt the flesh change, leaving many of the legion as little more than dust within their armor, animated by sorceress will, rather than biological life. And yet the legion remained. Battered and altered and carrying losses that would have destroyed a force of lesser resilience, the 1,000 Suns persisted as one of the great traitor legions, their names still carrying across 10,000 years a weight of fear and respect that spoke to what they had been and what they remained. What defined the culture of the 1,000 Suns in the long millennia after Prospero was not simply the sorcery and the power and the continued prosecution of Tizca's inscrutable designs across the galaxy. It was the legacy of what had been lost. Prospero was gone, had been gone for 10,000 years, and yet it remained present in the consciousness of the Legion in a way that no amount of time had been able to diminish. The libraries of Tizca were ash. The towers and academies and observatories that Magnus had built as monuments to the power of knowledge were rubble, or less than rubble, the very ground on which they had stood, scoured and broken by the fires of the space wolves. The accumulated wisdom of generations, the texts and artifacts and traditions that had made the 1,000 Suns the most intellectually sophisticated of all the legions, had been lost in ways that could never be fully recovered. This loss was not merely historical, not merely a fact about the past that could be acknowledged and then set aside in favor of the present. It was a wound that remained open, a source of grief and rage and identity that shaped everything the 1,000 Suns did and everything they were. They were a legion in exile, and they knew it, and the knowledge of what exile meant, of what had been taken from them and why, informed their culture at every level, from the way their sorcerers studied and the goals they pursued to the fury with which they fought when they took the field against the Immaterium that had burned their world. Magnus ruled over all of this, over the impossible world and the changed legion and the long exile that showed no sign of ending, with the full and terrible intelligence that had always defined him, now honed by 10,000 years of experience and shaped by the transformation that had made him something beyond human. He was still a scholar, in his way. Still a being who sought knowledge and found in its pursuit the closest thing to satisfaction that his existence now afforded him. Still capable, in his greatest moments, of something that resembled the wonder and the curiosity that had characterized the young Magnus of Prospero, that red-skinned scholar king in his city of towers who had believed that the universe was a mystery worth solving and that the solving of it was the highest thing a conscious being could aspire to. But the context in which those qualities now existed was so different from the context in which they had first flourished that the similarities were almost cruel in the contrast they created. He had wanted to build a civilization of knowledge. He had ended up ruling a kingdom of sorcery and exile and endless manipulation. He had wanted to understand the warp. He had ended up belonging to it. And he had wanted, above all, to be the kind of being that his great gift suggested was possible, a man whose brilliance was matched by wisdom, whose power was balanced by responsibility, whose love for those beneath him was expressed in protection rather than in the catastrophic losses that had followed so many of his greatest attempts to save the people he cared for. He had wanted to be that, and he had not managed it, and 10,000 years had not made the distance between what he had wanted to be and what he had become any easier to measure. The Long War. 10,000 years is a span of time that defeats most attempts at genuine comprehension. Civilizations rise and fall within it. Languages are born and die and are forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten again. The faces of worlds change beyond recognition, their geography rewritten by war and weather and the slow patient work of geological time. For ordinary human beings, 10,000 years is not a duration that can be experienced or imagined in any direct sense. It can only be contemplated from the outside, as a number, as an abstraction, as a measure of distance rather than of lived experience. For Magnus it was something else entirely. He lived those 10,000 years in the fullest sense, aware and active, and present within them in a way that no mortal being could have sustained, his consciousness persisting through the millennia within the churning and timeless environment of the Eye of Terror and the planet of the sorcerers. And throughout those 10,000 years, he returned. Not constantly, not with the relentless and mechanical regularity of a force of nature grinding away at a fixed target, but repeatedly, purposefully, at moments of his own choosing or at the direction of forces and designs that were not entirely his own. He came back into the material universe to wage war against the Immaterium that had burned his world, and each time he came back, he brought with him the accumulated weight of everything that had happened since Prospero, the grief and the rage and the power that 10,000 years of existence as a demon prince of Tizca had built in him beyond any measure that the Magnus of the Great Crusade would have recognized as possible. If there was a single thread of personal hatred that ran through Magnus's long war against the Immaterium with more consistency and more intensity than any other, it was the thread that connected him to the Space Wolves and to the world of Fenris that was their home. Leman Russ had come to Prospero. Leman Russ had led the legion that had burned his city and killed his sons and reduced everything he had built to ash and ruin. Russ himself had fought Magnus in single combat and inflicted wounds that had pushed him to the edge of destruction, had been the physical instrument of the most devastating moment in Magnus's existence. The fact that Russ himself had subsequently disappeared into the warp on his own strange and unresolved journey, that he was not present on Fenris to answer for what he had done, did not diminish the fury that Magnus directed at the legion the Wolf King had left behind. The Space Wolves were the heirs of Prospero's burning, the living continuation of the force that had destroyed the Thousand Suns world, and Magnus pursued them across the millennia with a consistency that spoke to something beyond military strategy or tactical calculation. The assaults he led against Fenris were among the most devastating campaigns of the Long War between the traitor forces and the Immaterium, combining the Thousand Suns' extraordinary psychic capabilities with the massed power of Tizcan forces in attacks that threatened to do to the Space Wolves' home world what the Space Wolves had once done to Prospero. The symmetry of it was not accidental. Magnus understood symmetry, and he understood what it would mean to leave Fenris in the same condition that Fenris's sons had left Prospero. The campaigns that Magnus led across the millennia were not uniform in their character or their objectives, because Magnus was not a being of simple and repetitive impulses. He did not simply return to real space again and again to perform the same act of destruction in different locations. His wars were as varied and as intellectually considered as everything else he did, shaped by the same analytical intelligence that had once designed the academic and psychic culture of the Thousand Suns, now applied to the very different problem of how to spread ruin and corruption across a galaxy that had spent 10,000 years learning to defend itself against exactly the kind of threat he represented. Some of his campaigns were primarily military in character, direct applications of the Thousand Suns' considerable combat power against imperial forces and installations. Others were subtler and more complex, combining open military action with the kind of psychic and sorcerous manipulation at which the Thousand Sons excelled, corrupting worlds not just through physical destruction but through the infection of their populations with the touch of Tzinch, leaving behind them not simply ruins but something worse, places where the fabric of reality had been weakened, and the influence of chaos had been embedded so deeply that it would continue to spread and deepen long after Magnus and his forces had withdrawn. These campaigns left scars on the Imperium that could not be simply repaired, that changed the affected regions in ways that the Administratum and the Inquisition were still attempting to manage centuries after the initial assault had ended. The return of Rabute Guilliman to the active affairs of the Imperium was one of the most significant events of the 41st millennium, a moment that reshuffled the balance of power between the forces of order and the forces of chaos in ways whose full implications are still unfolding. Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, had been preserved in stasis for 10,000 years following a confrontation during the heresy, neither dead nor living, held in a state of suspension that the technology of the Imperium could maintain but not resolve. His awakening, in the desperate circumstances of the late 41st millennium, brought back into the war a mind of extraordinary strategic capability and a leader whose symbolic importance to the Imperium was almost impossible to overstate. For Magnus, the return of Guilliman was something that demanded a response, not primarily because Guilliman represented a genuine military threat, though he certainly did, but because his return changed the nature of what the Long War meant and what its possible outcomes looked like. Magnus and Guilliman were not natural opposites in the way that Magnus and Leman Russ had been natural opposites. They were, in some respects, more similar than either might have been comfortable acknowledging, both of them beings of exceptional intellect who had devoted themselves to the project of building and sustaining human civilization, now on opposite sides of a war that had made the work of building almost impossible. Their conflicts in the tumultuous period of the Indomitus Crusade carried within them the weight of that uncomfortable parallel. Among the great campaigns of Magnus's Long War, those conducted in the Stygius sector stand as among the most complete expressions of what Tzinchian warfare looked like when directed by a commander of his capability. The Stygius sector was not a region of the Imperium that had any particular personal significance for Magnus, in the way that Fenris had personal significance, or Terra had personal significance. It was a target of strategic and sorcerous importance, a region whose fall would serve the designs of Tzinch in ways that extended beyond simple territorial acquisition into the deeper and more consequential business of reshaping the psychic landscape of the galaxy. The invasions Magnus led there were vast in scale, combining military force with psychic assault and the deliberate cultivation of chaos corruption in the affected populations, producing a campaign whose effects were felt not just in the immediate military terms of worlds won and lost but in the longer and harder to measure terms of what those worlds became in the aftermath. The Stygius campaigns demonstrated, in the most direct possible way, that 10,000 years had not diminished Magnus, had not reduced him from the terrifying and extraordinary force he had been during the heresy into something more manageable or more predictable. If anything, the millennia had deepened and refined what he was, adding layers of experience and understanding to a foundation of raw power that had always been almost without equal. In the 41st millennium and beyond, in the turbulent and desperate age that the Imperium calls the era Indomitus and that the forces of chaos call by other names, Magnus the Red endures as one of the most dangerous individual beings in the known galaxy. This is a statement that requires context to be properly appreciated, given the nature of the era in which it is made. The late 41st millennium is not a time of peace or stability in which the bar for being considered dangerous is set low. It is an age of apocalyptic warfare, of threats from within and without the Imperium that dwarf anything the Great Crusade era faced in their scale and their existential weight. In that context, to be described as one of the most dangerous psykers in existence is to occupy a position of truly extraordinary lethality. The millennia have added to Magnus's capabilities in ways that go beyond simple accumulation of power, though the power itself is vaster than it was at Prospero. They have given him a depth of experience with the warp and with the ways in which psychic force can be applied that no living being can match, a familiarity with the deep patterns of the immaterial realm that makes his sorcery something qualitatively different from what even the most gifted mortal psyker can achieve. He remains brilliant. He remains proud. He remains, in the deepest and most unalterable parts of what he is, the scholar of Prospero, the seeker after knowledge, the being who believed that understanding was the highest aspiration of a conscious mind. That these qualities now express themselves in the service of chaos and the ruin of the Immaterium is the final and most painful irony of a life that has never been short of them. Legacy. There are figures in the history of the Immaterium whose legacy is straightforward, whose meaning can be summarized without too much difficulty in terms of what they did and what those actions produced. They fought, or they built, or they sacrificed themselves in a moment of crisis, and the consequences of those acts can be traced forward through time in lines that are relatively clear and relatively direct. Magnus is not one of those figures. His legacy is not straightforward, cannot be summarized without loss, cannot be reduced to a simple accounting of achievements and failures without doing a violence to the complexity of what he actually was and what he actually means. He remains, 10,000 years after Prospero, the central figure of Thousand Suns' history and identity, the point around which everything the Legion is and everything it does continues to organize itself. In a legion of sorcerers and scholars, of warriors who define themselves by the pursuit of knowledge and the practice of psychic arts that most of the Immaterium regards with fear and revulsion, Magnus is not simply the founder or the commander. He is the reason. He is the principle that underlies all the specific practices and beliefs and traditions that make the Thousand Suns what they are. To understand a Thousand Sun, even now, even after 10,000 years of change and loss and transformation, you must understand Magnus, because the Legion he built in his image has never fully separated itself from that image, has never found a different foundation on which to stand. He is present in everything they do, not as a memory or a historical reference, but as a living and active force, still commanding, still shaping, still the Crimson King in every sense that matters. The Immaterium of mankind has many figures who are remembered as warriors. The canon of martial glory is vast and crowded, filled with the names and deeds of men and women and transhuman warriors who fought and bled and died in the service of humanity's survival, and whose memories are honored in the traditions of the organizations they served and the worlds they defended. Magnus is not remembered primarily as a warrior, though he was a warrior of extraordinary capability whose deeds on the battlefield were among the most remarkable of the Great Crusade era. He is remembered as something more specific and more troubling than that. He is remembered as a symbol of forbidden knowledge, as the embodiment of what happens when the desire to know exceeds the wisdom to know wisely, as a cautionary figure whose story the Immaterium has been telling itself in various forms for 10,000 years, without ever quite managing to extract from it a lesson simple enough to be reliably applied. The concept of forbidden knowledge is one of the defining ideas of the Immaterium's culture, an institution whose foundational documents include extensive and detailed prohibitions on the pursuit of certain categories of understanding. The Inquisition exists, in significant part, to enforce those prohibitions, to find the people who are looking into things that the Immaterium has decided should not be looked into, and to stop them. Magnus is what those prohibitions point back to, the original and most spectacular case of a mind that refused to accept that any door should remain permanently closed, and that paid a price for that refusal that the Immaterium has never stopped citing as justification for the doors it keeps locked. In the lore of the current age, in the understanding of Magnus that his surviving sons carry within them and that the scholars and inquisitors and historians of the Immaterium have constructed from the evidence of 10,000 years, he is no longer fully describable in the language that was adequate for him at the time of Prospero. The categories that applied to him then, brilliant scholar, gifted psyker, loving father of a legion, complicated and difficult son of the emperor, still apply in the sense that they point towards real things about his nature. But they are insufficient now, insufficient to describe what he has become and what he continues to be in the churning and impossible reality of the 42nd millennium. He is a demonic demigod, a being whose existence spans the boundary between the material and the immaterial in a way that is no longer a matter of extraordinary psychic sensitivity but of fundamental ontological nature. He belongs to the warp in the way that a living being belongs to the material world, not as a visitor or an explorer but as a native, as something that the warp has incorporated into its own substance and that now, in some sense, incorporates the warp in return. He is bound to fate in the way that Tzinch is bound to fate, which is to say both completely and not at all, both the instrument of a destiny that was written before he was born and the author of designs that nothing in the universe could have predicted. He is magic, in the oldest and most complete sense of that word, a force that acts upon reality from outside the rules that govern reality, that bends and shapes the world according to a will that is no longer entirely his own and perhaps never fully was. And yet, beneath the demonic power and the 10,000 years of war, and the ascension and the transformation, and all the vast and terrible accumulation of what Magnus has become since the fires of Prospero were lit, beneath all of it, the same thing persists that was there at the beginning. In the libraries of Tizca and the observatories of a world that no longer exists and the quiet hours of study under the guidance of an old seer called Eamon who believed that wisdom mattered as much as brilliance. The tragedy persists. It has not been resolved by time or by power or by the transformation of Magnus from a mortal Primarch into a demonic demigod of extraordinary capability. If anything, it has been deepened by those things, made more visible by contrast, the way a flaw in a gemstone becomes more apparent as the stone is polished rather than less. He was a brilliant son, the most gifted of all the Emperor's children, a being whose intellectual and psychic capabilities exceeded those of every other individual of his era save only the Emperor himself. He sought enlightenment with a purity of intention that, whatever his failures and his pride and his catastrophic errors of judgment, was genuine and admirable and expressed something real about the best of what an intelligent being can aspire to. He believed, with a conviction that his entire life's experience gave him reason to hold, that he could master the impossible, that the powers other people feared were simply problems he had not yet fully understood, that knowledge and discipline and the sheer force of his extraordinary mind could take him safely through territories that would destroy anyone else. And he lost everything in the attempt. The loss was not sudden and it was not simple and it did not happen in a single moment that could be identified and isolated and examined as the turning point, the place where it all went wrong, the decision that, if made differently, would have produced a different outcome. It happened the way most great losses happen, gradually and then all at once, through the accumulation of choices each of which was defensible in isolation and catastrophic in combination. The bargain for his legion's survival that cost him his eye and bound him to something he did not fully understand. The continued studies after Nicaea that told him, at some level deeper than conscious thought, that he had placed his own judgment above the authority of the Emperor in a way that could not easily be undone. The ritual that saved the 1,000 sons from Prospero and breached the webway and shattered his faith in the Father he had crossed the galaxy to warn. The turn to chaos that was not a single dramatic act of apostasy but a slow and painful reorientation of everything he had believed, driven by grief and rage and the cold logic of a situation that seemed to offer no other exit. Each of these moments was a step, and each step made the next one more likely, and the path they collectively described led somewhere that Magnus, standing at its beginning in the libraries of Tizca with his single blazing eye and his copper-red skin and his absolute conviction that knowledge was the highest good, could not have imagined was its destination. He endures. That is perhaps the most important thing to say about Magnus the Red at the end of his story, which is not yet an end, which may not have an end in any time frame that mortal minds can contemplate. He endures on the planet of the sorcerers in the Eye of Terror, ruling his kingdom of impossible geometry and endless sorcery, commanding his legion of exiled scholars and sorcerers, pursuing the designs of Tzinch with an intelligence that has never dimmed across 10,000 years of loss and transformation. He endures in the memory of the Thousand Sons, for whom he is not a historical figure but a present reality, a Primarch who is still among them in the most literal sense, still shaping their destiny with the same fierce and comprehensive attention he has always brought to the things he cares about. He endures in the fear of the Immaterium, in the inquisitorial records that document his campaigns and the librarian traditions that name him as one of the supreme psychic threats the Emperor's realm has ever faced. And he endures in the imagination of anyone who has ever looked at his story and felt, beneath the horror and the tragedy of it, something that resembles recognition. The recognition of a mind that wanted too much, that reached too far, that trusted itself beyond what the evidence justified, and that paid for that trust in a currency so total and so final that no subsequent achievement or power or immortality has ever fully settled the account. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the sorcerer of Prospero, the most gifted son of the most powerful being humanity has ever produced. A warning written in fire and loss and 10,000 years of war. In a language that the Immaterium has never stopped trying, and never quite managed, to fully read.